Thank you. It being after 6 o'clock, the time for which this school committee meeting has been posted, I'll read the agenda and then call to order in the Pledge of Allegiance, which is the first item on our agenda, the superintendent's update, discussion of items, which are the enrollment update and Metro West Youth Risk Survey. Item 4 is citizens' requests. Item 5 is school committee reports and action items, of which would include a vote to endorse the revised zero-emission vehicle policy. We have a red line version of what we had approved, I'm going to say in May of last year, of last year, this year. My God. The review of the final revised policy and approval of the budget summit meeting minutes of 9/26/24 and approval of minutes of 10/2/24. So with that, all those who are able, please rise for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And so, already having read the agenda, we can move on to the superintendent's update. Allison?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Slides all ready to go. Can you put it in? There we go. A few just sort of nice to know items to start off with. Our volleyball team held their Dig Pink matchup last week.
Can you move the mic a little closer?
Oh, absolutely. So they held their Dig Pink matchup versus Algonquin, and Dig Pink, for folks who are unfamiliar, is a fundraising game, and it's to support the Side Out Foundation, an organization that has the mission of helping support folks living with metastatic breast cancer. They raised over $8,000 in this one evening, and that kind of blew out of the water the previous sort of high total of just over $6,000. So kind of a neat way of showcasing how our sports teams, even from the very start of the year with Rangers Give Back, are really engaged in kind of supporting the community, not just sort of out there having fun, but also out there having fun too. So that's one nice piece of news. And then the other, this is late breaking, we have some of our sixth graders out in the Great Barrington area participating in Nature's Classroom. This is the second year that they're running this program. And it really is an opportunity for kids to kind of come together as a community, learn together as a community, with a focus on building community, but also on sort of the science standards, especially things you can kind of learn out by doing things hands-on. They're getting great weather out there and enjoying themselves so far very much. Also worth noting that Mill Pond pulled off this very quick little fundraiser last week. It was sort of a spur-of-the-moment thing to raise money for victims of the hurricanes down south, and in just a couple days pulled together over $4,000 to send toward hurricane relief. So thought I wanted to share some sort of nice news updates before we dig into the very exciting world of state funding for education in Massachusetts. So I wanted to put together a few slides to give an overview of how state funding works, because a number of times during the past few meetings, especially in the budget meeting, questions do come up about Chapter 78 and about circuit breaker, what those are and what they're about. And kind of for you all and for the viewing public, it's an opportunity to just give some basic information. I'm not going to get too far into the weeds here, because you can really get into the weeds with Chapter 70. There's a gentleman who's a finance director over in Worcester that runs a 7-hour course on Chapter 70. So we're not doing that at all. This is the 5-minute speed version here. But Chapter 70 is the major program by which the state provides aid to city and towns to support schools. And it also requires or establishes minimum spending requirements for school districts to make sure that school districts are funding their schools appropriately. In FY25, state aid to Westborough under Chapter 70 is over $12 million. So it's a reasonable chunk of change that comes into the town. How does it work? Well, it's based on this notion of assuring fair and adequate funding. So the whole premise of Chapter 70 is not about providing an exceptional education, which is what I think Westborough is interested in. It is about providing sort of a basic starting point, and then cities and towns can fund above and beyond that starting point. The way it works is that the state establishes what's called a foundation budget, a total amount that will assure we are providing that adequate funding for education. And it's based on per pupil enrollment of October 1st the prior year. And kind of what goes into understanding that enrollment isn't just the number of students, it's the number, the grade level, the needs of the students, and also some other factors that kind of come into play. So I'll break it down a little bit more here. The budget will change on an annual basis along with the student enrollment and all those factors due to inflation, something called a wage adjustment rate, which is applied to certain towns where the cost of living is higher and it's just harder to afford being in the town. And there's also a sort of phase-in of some adjustments to the formula in the wake of the Student Opportunity Act, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So again, I said the base funding is dependent on the number of students per grade level in pre-K, grades 1 through 5, 6 through 8, and 9 through 12. And each of those bands has sort of a different base number associated with it per student. Additionally, there are sort of add-ons per student based on ELL status or low income status, and the state defines low income as 185% of the federal poverty level, okay? There are some assumptions built into the foundation formula that are probably not at all realistic. Again, they're just trying to spread money out fairly throughout the Commonwealth, but they assume that 1% of total enrollment might be placed out of district in special education schools, and that a little under 4% of students are in special education in a district. That number is clearly nowhere near reality, but again, it's just sort of a mechanism for figuring out how to fairly assign funds. And I already mentioned the wage adjustment factor. So essentially the math boils down to district enrollment times this differentiated per pupil rate. What all goes into that rate is interesting. So the state sort of says, here's a list of things that we think it takes to run a basic education. And you see that list there on the right: administration, instructional leadership, and so on. They don't consider everything that we do as necessary for an adequate education. So, for example, transportation isn't factored at all into creating the foundation budget. That's part of the reason why so many communities are paying above and beyond that foundation rate, okay? So this is the simplest possible graphic of what it looks like. So the state establishes a total foundation budget of X number of dollars that we need to pay. And then it establishes an amount that the town should pay. You know, there's a local contribution. And then anything above and beyond that to reach the foundation, the state chips in. So they look at our per pupil information. They look at some information about the town and the wealth of the town. They decide how much the town can chip in, and then the state pitches in the rest. And then what happens in this community and many, many others is there's local contribution above and beyond. So that's Chapter 70 in a nutshell, right there. How do they determine the local community share? That is a very complex question, but this is the simplest version. They try to target a number based on 50% of property value and 50% of income within the town. And they also cap local contribution at 82.5% of the foundation budget. So no matter how wealthy a town is, no one is going to ever pay more than 82.5% of foundation budget. That means, you know, Weston, Dover, anywhere you can imagine, they're still getting state aid. Everyone gets a little bit of state aid. The things that can affect Local contribution are also things that are about new growth. So the municipal revenue growth factor they calculate includes things like levy limit, new growth, state aid. Ironically, it keeps sort of feeding itself, and then receipts from the prior year. So they sort of bundle all that together to make a determination of how much Westborough could conceivably contribute. In 2019, with the Student Opportunity Act, people took a look at the foundation budget and started to look at ways where it wasn't really capturing what an adequate education is nowadays. And so they've made some changes to the formula. Those are being phased in over time, so it's not a sudden hit to the state budget. And some of those changes include changes to the factors for calculating the differential for English language learners or students with lower income. They've increased the factors for things that are costly to districts, like benefits, guidance and psychological services, and out-of-district tuition rates. And they're slowly increasing their assumption about the percentage of students receiving special education services. Not by a lot, but by a little. Again, this is the state trying to sort of grow the way they calculate this so that they can take whatever money they have and spread it out to communities in a way that feels fair. So again, kind of in a nutshell, the key areas that impact the Chapter 78 that come into Westborough are this notion of what is in the foundation budget based on enrollment, a wage inflation factor, and inflation in general. And then the local contribution, property value, income, and any municipal growth. And total together, that's what kind of comprises foundation budget and Chapter 70 aid. Just as a point of comparison, you know, the Westborough gets substantially more state aid than the community that I worked in before, but substantially less than, say, Worcester. So it really just depends on a lot of the factors that all kind of coming together. That's our local contribution. I wanted to make sure to get that part in. And again, it is very important that I don't think there are many communities out there that just squeak by with the foundation budget because, as you saw, it doesn't really realistically capture what's happening in schools nowadays. I also wanted to do a little bit of information about Circuit Breaker. Because you hear about that as an offset to our budget. It's a program that was started in FY04, and it was really designed to help offset the high cost of some special education services that are, you know, very important to provide and very costly, and often can create a sense of unpredictability in the budget. So it's a reimbursement, and it covers only really two buckets. One is special education tuition and services, so that's tuition at schools outside of Westborough, and out-of-district transportation. And it works through two claiming periods, essentially. An annual claiming period in July where we do a look back and create a big spreadsheet that basically submits expenses that would qualify for the prior year. So this July, they'll look back throughout this year, submit that to the state, and then the state looks at our numbers, qualifies the things, agrees with us, we hope, and will start to pay out quarterly in September of this year. So we are getting funding this year for last year's expenses. They do have an extraordinary relief provision that allows us to submit claims in March if we are in the middle of a year where our expenses are pitched at 125% of the tuition that was eligible from the prior year. They don't do it for transportation, which is unfortunate because that's where a lot of the escalation in cost is nowadays, but they will do it for tuition. So that's a little bit of a helpful strategy for districts if they're kind of caught in a situation that they really did not anticipate. So the state pays up to 75% of costs above a certain threshold. And I just broke down an example for you based on FY23 numbers. So they determine through a series of kind of factors what is a threshold of eligibility. So that the district's expected to pay that amount, and then above that, it's 75% of whatever is an overage. So if the threshold in FY23 was 49,494, which is kind of a fun number, and we have a student whose special education costs are at 105, you subtract it and get the differential, multiply by 75%, and you end up with the 41,000 and change coming back to the district the following year, if everything works. It's important to note that that's up to 75% because this is very dependent on availability of state funds. So there have been years, for example, when the state has says, we don't have the money to pay that high level of reimbursement. A few years ago, it was down around 49%. So again, all of this makes it a very sort of hard to get your arms around part of the budget. So when we are putting together the budget, and when we look at this part of it, it's a certain amount of predicting kind of where our students are going to be next year, what the cost of that will be, and what are the funds coming into us based on what's happening this year. So it's a lot of moving parts, and fortunately, we have a fantastic team looking at it. So I think that was it. So that's it for the slideshow stuff. I have a couple other quick notes for you verbally. Anybody have questions about either of those two things?
I have a question.
Sure.
Is the Chapter 70 money, is it contingent upon the legislature having passed a ballot, having passed a budget?
That's a great question. I actually don't know that. I assume it's part of that. Tim might.
Not sure off the top of my head. I will say that was another question I had that I realized I could probably answer at work as well of, what determined that threshold and whether or not the state is able to pay that out. So that's something I can look into, but I don't have right now for you. So.
Yeah.
I guess I would just comment that the Chapter 70 money doesn't come to the school budget, it goes to the town.
Right.
And it shows up as an item on the cherry sheet for the town. The circuit breaker does come back to the school committee's budget, but as Allison has pointed out, it's a calculation from a prior year, so that money's already been spent out of our existing budget, and then it shows up as a revenue in the future year.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it's the funding flows to the town side, but it's a sort of part of the big pot of things that the town has to decide how to divvy up, and it's important that the intent of it really is to support the town's support of education. So even if it isn't earmarked specifically, it's in the mix, which I like and is worth spending some time for people to understand. Since if we do see changes in it, we would want to know that those changes are intended to benefit kind of schools and the town's support of the schools overall. Yes, please.
Just one comment. Well, first of all, thank you for this. I think that was very well presented. One question, you mentioned that there's some amounts you don't know upfront because it's up to the state how what funds are available. At which point in the process budget do you know that information?
This year, it's sort of when they make those allocation determinations. So it's in September when they sort of say, here's what you're actually going to get back. And that changes from year to year. It's been pretty good the last few years. They've come in at 75 or close to 75%. But, in certain, I think the low percentage that came in might have been kind of COVID-related expenses were up everywhere. So. Because it was right around this time. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, that sounds right. And I think, they tell us over sometime during the summer what the rate of reimbursement is going to be.
Right.
But so we go through like this school year, not knowing what next year until the summer,
right,
in terms of what rate we'll get reimbursed at for the kiddos that we have this year.
And
historically, we get information from our state rep in terms of what it looks like. So there's a little, I guess, upfront knowledge of sort of the range before it finally happens.
Yeah.
And since we have, I can't remember whether we have 2 reps or 3 reps, but that represented the gerrymandered Westborough. Yeah. But anyway, all of them seem to write a a report to the town, as a joint report to tell us what they think is going to happen.
That's great. That is,
So the Chapter 70 reimbursements, they are, there's no requirement for allocation on that since it's going directly to the town?
no, it doesn't, it's not required to come directly to the schools.
But there is no,
No, it goes to the cherry
goes-
sheet, and the
goes to
cherry
the-
sheet turns into free cash.
right.
And so, as I mentioned before, the free cash is what funds most of the town's, let's say, needs. And the alternative, if it doesn't come from there, would be raise and appropriate or to borrow money.
It's, a mechanism for the town to kind of support our school budget, without having to do other things, we hope. Many other things. I think the other thing about Chapter 70 or about the circuit breaker, kind of back to Jakub's question, is that some of the things that we put in for qualifying expenses, sometimes they don't all clear. Like they'll say, no, we don't really think that meets the requirements. We have folks who work really hard on making sure we get everything in there, though, that can possibly be. So it's quite a process, Along the lines of budget, I want to just give you a quick update about where things are internally. We have I've worked with Anita and Kelly and Tony on the capital needs and looking at kind of information that we have that's up to date. And I'll be sharing with you very soon kind of draft versions of changes that we're going to make to the proposed long-term plan for that. We're really trying to be thoughtful about what's an immediate need that should be addressed this year or next year, and what can be delayed for another year or two, just so those expenses can get spread out in a way that's responsible for us, doesn't get us caught in a way that's not safe or healthy for our kids, and is also mindful of the fact that the schools have invested a lot lately, so we're trying to balance all that out. But I've asked them to give me their true, honest appraisal of where things are and what the needs are, so I'll be sharing that with you soon. You had asked about setting up a meeting in executive session for police and fire, and I'm working on that. I've met with the police department, I'm meeting with the fire department, and we're looking at a date, so I'll be sharing with a couple possibilities with you very soon. I'm just waiting to hear back from them. And then finally, I wanted to let you know, last night I had the opportunity to meet with a group of local citizens through the Civic Leadership Academy program, which is a really cool program that did not exist in my former district, but Westborough does. It's essentially folks in the town who are interested in getting involved in town leadership and governance in different ways, and different municipal departments are involved in sort of telling them a little bit about what we do and what the responsibilities of, for example, the school committee include. It was a fantastic group of folks. It seemed to go well, and hopefully there'll be people who are tuning in and showing up to support your work, and maybe even asking you questions. So don't be surprised if you get some email. Okay, and that's it for me tonight. Oh, it's not it from me. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
I was gonna say.
One other thing. We have the
Before you look back, that's all.
the accept Q1 report and financial update is attached in your packet. I will say this is an organization that I'm just getting to know. I actually have a meeting with them on September 30th. So I would say at this juncture, if there are questions or comments you have that you want me to take back from the board here to accept, I am happy to do that. I will note that at this time, we have only one student enrolled at accept in terms of our work with the collaborative. So there are other ways that they benefit us, but in terms of enrolling kids, it's relatively few right now.
So my question is on the financial update section of the letter. is their budget is given as 18,587,355 versus the fiscal year actual to date is only 3,133,000. And at this time of the year, we should be pushing maybe half of that. So I guess I would be interested in the explanation as to why that be the case.
Great question. Yep. Okay, I can find that out.
Obviously, it's in our favor at this point, but since the budget says they're going to spend that much money, I guess it'd be interesting to know how come it's, in the form that it is right now. Other than that, I guess it's nice to see. I think this is the first one that we've seen from them since we joined middle of last year, maybe it was the end of last year, but about then. So, good. Anybody else? Okay, maybe we move on.
Okay. I am going to give you the enrollment update now. So,
Okay, Daniel, your
yeah.
turn.
Thank you. Good evening. So I've kind of broken this up into 3 parts. It's not a particularly long presentation, but just so you are aware, we're going to talk first about like this year's enrollment and class size, so you get a look at where things stand, and then talk about enrollment over time, looking at a historic look of this year, looking back in time, so where we are in relation to prior years, and then give you an estimate for where we think we will be potentially next year and some comments about future enrollment. The community, as you know, because this body sets the guidelines, values small class sizes. And one could argue that having our small class sizes is a key to the success of the education program we have here in Westborough. And so these are the guidelines that we operate off of year to year. As you can see, they get a little larger in terms of sizes as kids go up in grades, but we don't go larger than 25 when we're in the middle school, so that's the highest. But at the early elementary, we're wanting to be somewhere between 16 and 21 at the kindergarten and first grade level. So that's the kind of range that's there. And this next slide shows you that our K-3 numbers in all 3 of our schools are within those guidelines. You can look down and see the comparative look at the kindergarten numbers and our first grade, second and third by looking at the columns there. I do always put an asterisk with the date stamps just so you know that these numbers can sometimes change. So in the bottom left, there's, I looked before this evening, and it really hasn't changed much since 10/8, so it's not that long ago. But in any case, very, very good class numbers. And we knew that, predicted that going into this year when we were setting the budget last year, and it was a high priority in these post-COVID years to maintain small class sizes. Then we get up in the grade levels, grades 4 through 8. Same thing, the class sizes are well within the guidelines, very, nice sized classes. We don't even get close to that 25 in the middle school. So averaging, 22 and 21.5 at grade 7 and 8. As you know, the high school operates differently with all the electives and different sections by, you'll have multiple groupings of different classes. And so we talk about sections rather than class sizes, but they're kind of one and the same in some ways. But what they talk about always is how many sections do we have of English, 9, how many sections do we have of such and such elective. And so what we do is we break out all the different sections and take a look at them. And as you can see here, 513 sections are 25 or fewer students. So that's very good. There is some range in there. Some classes will be, in the mid-teens. Other ones will be low 20s. A few will bump up against 25. And then you can see that there's 26 sections here that are in that 26 students to 29 students. So there's 26 sections. When we have those kind of those numbers, we try, part of the reason we run into that is because of our performing arts program and the scheduling and trying to make sure that students get everything that they ask for in terms of their, when they sign up for their courses. And then there's just this cluster of time where there's the big ensembles are coming together in the D wing. And so sometimes we have to have sections that are slightly larger so that all those students can, before the D wing ensembles are getting together so that then they can go off and participate in performing arts program. We try to avoid getting up to that range, but when we do have classes that are that size, we tend to make sure that they're students that are, highly invested in their education, that they're, that kids who are maybe needing some more intense supportive environment would be in some smaller class sizes. But, again, we try to avoid going up above 25, but there are some instances where we're not able to accomplish that. This next slide gives you a look at year over year how the grade levels vary in terms of the enrollment numbers. And it's worth looking at because, it gives you some perspective on looking at this year. We know we have a small kindergarten at 225. So we do often get a number of students that'll come in between K and 1, but this is a relatively small kindergarten year for sure. But you can see how we sort of bounce around between mid 200s to up to 300 and even above 300 in this year's seniors are at 331. But you can look at grade 1, for example, and see it is a higher enrollment number than grade 2 and grade 4. So you get this K class that comes in that's relatively small, but last year's class was relatively big compared to some other classes. And then our grade 3 class in particular, that's still in the K3 schools, that's larger. The K3 class is larger than grade 4. It's larger than grade 6 rather, and 9 and 10. So there's this sort of up and down that happens to some degree. But when you look at the next slide, you can see that over time, we're remarkably stable. This slide, Allison's shown in a different setting, and she highlighted a couple of the numbers there where you can see our peak was at 4,026 back in 2017-18 school year. This school year, we're at 3,848. So as you look across, looking at the 4,000 threshold, we're just skirting just below there. The average over these years that are presented here are 3,881 students in any given year. So this year, when we're at 3,848, we're 34 students down from the average this year. And then in thinking ahead to what will next year look like, given the size of that graduating class that I was showing you a minute ago, being particularly large, and our particularly small kindergarten that just came in, we're anticipating that we will drop down a little bit more next year. 3,765 is the number that we have, but there's a couple of things that are always squishy in terms of kindergarten class in particular is the one where we don't know exactly, the census data is not good enough for us to really know with exact accuracy what our kindergarten class is going to look like. So we take a 4-year average of the last 4 years and then plug that in. And so the 3,765 number has that kindergarten average built into it. But this year we were off by a substantial amount because of that unusually small size. A couple of years ago, we had we've had the opposite happen to us. The other thing is that we do have people are still enrolling There's sort of, it's more fluid than it used to be. So we've got people who are enrolling, but there's people who are leaving. And so we can update you later in the school year in terms of where things stand. But that's where we are right now in terms of our predictions for next year and where we stand right now.
That's a question.
Yeah, sure.
Those numbers are from the previous years. They are from the same time period, from like October, or are they at the end of the school year?
Yeah, there's something that's called the October count that, and the State Department of Education collects the data, and we give it to them now a couple of times a year. It used to be that it was really just the October count. But what they do is they freeze the time point and put the data up on their website. And so I'm pretty sure, Allison, I don't know if you know this, but I think they may even update the numbers. Like the numbers that are there for last year might not be our October numbers. They might be our March or
numbers,
June numbers. But in any case, it's apples to apples until you get to the, this year. So basically, you can go onto the Department of Education websites, see where they froze our, basically the time period. So that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Then the other thing in terms of like getting a handle on what's going to happen with our enrollment, we did this several years ago. We worked with a company that's called the New England School Development Council. They specialize in working with school districts on enrollment and projecting enrollment. And we're working with them to help us get a handle. They have two different reports they'll generate for you, which is like the down and dirty sort of prediction that's like doesn't cost a substantial amount of money for them to run, but they don't really start doing comparisons to other communities and looking in detail at your planning and housing stock and what's on tap for building in the future. So we're going to definitely go with them in getting this sort of more streamlined report. And we're talking about having, and Allison, feel free to chime in, obviously, we're having this more involved study, especially since the town is looking at housing and making some, changes in terms of permitting. And so we're going to get NASDAQ numbers for us. I don't know the timeline. Do you know when?
I think they do it kind of on a rolling basis, which is why we got our information into them early. So I'll hear back from them soon about what the timeline is, but I think they turn that around pretty quickly. I'm hopeful we get it,
right,
tomorrow. But
we'll have like one set of numbers based on that group's calculations, but then in terms of the second, that's sort of a discussion that the committee needs to have, and there's some cost involved in contracting with NASDAQ to have them do that study, right?
Absolutely. I'm going to meet with the executive director and their kind of lead demographer person to get a sense of the different types of work they can do and what the price point is for those, and then I sort of bring those back to you as some options for us to look at. Depending on what they offer, it might be worthwhile, but I really want to hear more about what they do and how they do it, kind of methodology-wise, to get a sense of if they are really, truly looking carefully at a lot of factors in the community. It would be worthwhile. If not, if it's just sort of a repackaged version of something, I don't want to pay for that. So we'll see what they have to say, and I'll be back.
Right. Yeah. So a couple more things, and then I'll finish up here and take questions. This gives you a view of the schools themselves and what our predictions are in terms of how enrollment will change next year. We have our current kindergartners, first, second, and third grades are already in there, and so we know what our third grade class looks like in terms of numbers, and we know so who's going from our K-3 schools into Mill Pond, like what the numbers look like. We're predicting at this phase that the elementary schools will go down somewhere between the 23 and 10 here. 23 at Fales, Hastings maybe 10 students, and Armstrong 13. Mill Pond will go up a little bit with 17 additional. And Gibbons was going to go down by 23, and with that large 12th grade class graduating this year, the high school we're predicting will go down by 40. And so the overall number that we've come up with here is potentially being down by 92 students next year. Again, assuming that the 4-year running average of our kindergarten number is, is accurate, okay? So just again, to reiterate, we're seeing a slight decrease between this year and last year, but really a lot of stability when you look over time in terms of what our enrollment is. It's like up towards that 4,000 number. We do anticipate with, the numbers going down somewhat between this year and next year. We have like increased needs that are post-COVID needs that rather than coming to the committee and asking for additional staff, we think we might be able to cover without asking for additional staff. So we have like an increasing ELL population, and there's some complex learning needs in other areas too. But we're hoping to be able to, sort of use that slight dip in enrollment to not ask for any staffing or minimal. And then, as I mentioned, there's the NASDAQ studies that'll help inform us and as we're going through the budget process. So that's it. Questions?
I think you covered what most people would wonder is, given the reduction in the number of students in the school system, what does that mean relative to the school budget? And I think your answer simply is that there are things that we need to fix relative to the COVID period, and this respite allows us to do some of that.
To add to that, I would, echo that, but also that it sounds as though the type of student or the needs of the students that are enrolling on an ongoing basis, it's very fluid, like you said, and I think that it's been more fluid in the past, how many years would you say? 4 or 5 years than it had been in the past.
Definitely in the last 4
It's
or 5
probably
years.
a very complex thing to wrap, to really understand the cost of because I would be interested to see what the cost of the students are in terms of by need, on some level to try and understand that. But I can understand why the actual numbers going down would not necessarily affect our budget in that way.
Right.
I
I
think
will say that, the MCAS report, which I'm going to give you in a couple of sessions, it'll be in their November meeting, so the meeting after next. You will see that, like with the state, that in ELA, that there's a downward slope that, we're all the communities are sort of dealing with. That our numbers, by and large, are very strong, but we have the same kind of downward slope that you see in terms of achievement over the last 3 years. And so the percent of kids in the early elementary grades in particular meeting or exceeding expectations has gone down over the last 3 years.
I think one of the other things that will make a difference is the town's emphasis on additional housing by virtue of changing zoning and redeveloping other resources, I guess, that are out there from whatever form they were in to more residential occupancy, which is an unknown. Certainly it will take a little bit of time for all of that to come to pass. But let's say in the next 5 years, I think we will see additional residential spaces that will fill up, and we'll see what that does to the school system.
So the only other question I had, and it's more of a comment, but so this was something I've mentioned previously about, the difference between the numbers in fails and some of the other elementary schools. I just want to understand, what is the trigger point here in terms of, in terms of the districting. I assume that even many of the new students that are coming in, this is a total assumption, but based on, I guess, whether it's rentals or whether they're purchasing and where, but that a lot of them are coming into Hastings and Armstrong as opposed to into Fails. Is that a wrong assumption?
I think in terms of, so there are kind of 2 parts to that. I'd need to look to see where students are moving to town to get really accurate information for folks who are permanently kind of intending to settle in Westborough. One thing to be aware of is for students who are here under McKinney-Vento, which is for homeless students, those students were actually sending to all 3 schools. So we are kind of doing that based on class size and some things like that, keeping families together, obviously, but really making an effort to ensure that every community is sort of wrapping its arms around those kids. So
Okay, perfect. Actually, that was to my question, so thank you.
I do have a few questions. So I know that we've talked about how the numbers are relatively fluid and do change. I know that Steve also just mentioned the housing and that there could be outside influences as well. I'm not sure, Daniel, if you have a sense of how much, like how static these numbers are. So like looking at like kindergarten and the smaller class sizes that we see in the younger grades, like if we expect those to increase over time, or if typically those usually stay closer to where they start.
So you're talking about like looking at these particular class size numbers and saying,
Sorry,
asking me just to clarify whether we expect them to change in some fundamental way?
So I apologize, I think I misspoke. Not class size, but enrollments. So the overall enrollment. So I'm looking at the bar graph currently, and
Got
now
it, got it,
there's fewer students enrolled in specifically K through 4, and just whether or not we expect to see an increase in enrollments over time, or if those are likely to stay relatively where they are.
That's part of what I was alluding to in terms of wanting to get a study from NESDIC, but also I was also making the point when you look at the like grade 3 is not a small class, and grade 1, is still larger than a couple of the classes that are over at Mill Pond. So you sort of get this up and down that's going there. And so I think it's too early to say that there's, a real downward tick here. Like I said, I think our kindergarten was unusually small, and I've been here, in years where that kindergarten number is just does the opposite.
And also, with respect to the, so we in a correlation, if we're talking about a kindergarten class versus a 12th grade class, I mean, there's a lot more movement happening than there used to be as well, I would say, right? So the actual changes in the class sizes are, I mean, I see huge differences, not huge, but I mean, quite a few numbers. And so is there a real correlation there anymore? Or, in terms of what you're expecting, when you made the estimate for what you'd be expecting your next class size to be? I'm just.
So, I mean, at the elementary level, we will look at the size of the grade and reallocate often staff to a different grade level based on the size of how many sections we need. So I think that's what you're asking is like, to what degree do we look at our numbers and make sure that we don't become too small or too large in different areas in terms of classes?
Well, actually, I'm talking about more over the bar graph that he's talking about. So I'm talking about how we're predicting this downward tick, but I'm not sure. I'm just wondering if there's actually a correlation there, but it's more of a comment. It's just me pondering the thought, so.
Okay.
Well, one of the things I would suggest is that, the first, let's say the kindergarten through 3 period of time is an area where there was a lot of unrest in, let's say in the United States, in this area in terms of work, who was working where. I think generally we could probably say that the housing stock in Westborough was fairly stable during that period of time. And certainly the owners of those houses are getting older each year. And so to the extent that, say, new employees weren't in the general area, or particularly maybe not coming to Westborough but going somewhere else for some of the demographics and dynamics of the community here, all of that stuff plays in here. And I think, the consultant that is going to review not only the housing stock, but the trends in the area is probably how we'll get the number for early grades coming up. But it's kind of obvious if you look at the class sizes, say from 7 to 12, most of those are pretty close to 300. Whereas if you look at the grade levels below that, there's a differential there between the upper average number of students versus the K through 6. So as we move on in the next 6 years, we'll see the number, I think, of total students in the system drop unless the demographics of the town in terms of the town's push for additional residences does something to the community and the number of kids in the system, which is, highly probable, I think, given what we're going to see at this special town meeting and other zoning changes that are afoot. So, however, one of the things we do know is that as long as we have the same number of employees in the school system, that in fact the total bill is never going to be less. No one expects to get paid less next year than they did this year. And I think that's a trend that has been going on for the last 100 years.
I think that's true.
Just going to say, a comparative story would be when I was, I'm going to say 18, I bought a brand new pickup truck, a Chevy pickup truck, for less than $3,000. If I was going to buy that same truck today, we're talking at least 40,000 and maybe 60. So if you want to figure out what the pay has been since then on an annual salary basis, I think that's a good indicator of the reason why nothing goes down, including your taxes. So it is what it is, and we have to do the best we can with what shows up at the door every start of school.
One thing I just I'm glad you moved back to this slide, Daniel. I think you do see a difference between the kind of upper grades and lower grades on the bar graph in terms of the composition of class size. So there's a suggestion that we do have a downward trend going on right now, but the amount of the trend is it's really not dramatic compared to a lot of places, and I just want to note that. The differential is not very high yet in terms of overall enrollment here over the arc of the last 10 years. You've been a remarkably stable place, and we're not seeing any dramatic turn in any direction, and I think that's helpful in terms of planning. We know that if things tick down slightly or up slightly, we're going to be in an okay place next year. That's very comforting, and there's not, a strange bubble or a big dramatic dip that's moving its way through the schools. So it's just a helpful thing for us for planning purposes, because it means, programs can continue to run and things like that. When you have that big sort of swing up and down, which can happen in some communities, particularly when they just have less housing, it gets kind of frozen up and then all vacated at once and then repopulated. It's hard to kind of maintain programs over time. You've got a nice sort of stable thing going here, and I hope it continues. But we are going to look carefully at what NESDEC provides us and at the options for a more in-depth study for them, because, if we are seeing a little bit of a fall off, we want to plan for that. And if we think there might be a chance of a big uptick, we want to plan for that too, either way. Right now, it's looking like, slightly down, but nothing more to say, really.
Yeah, I mean, I would look at, you look at 2016, 17, and you're at 3805, and then you have 3 years of like a bump up.
Yeah.
And then you're basically at 3,800 for like the last several years. Yeah. So in some sense, it's like there was a bubble, it's gone through, and it's like premature to say that we're like really on the...
And I would be curious, I understand that it is premature and that, any planning relating to these numbers is likely very far in the future. But Allison, as you're talking about the planning, especially as you're talking about the whole Chapter 70 funding process, just to understand, so if these numbers do come to pass and there is a slight dip for the 2025 to 2026 year, we would potentially be seeing slightly less state funding in 2 years. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, interestingly, that slight dip may be offset by some of the changes in that state funding formula. So I'm not actually anticipating a major change. One nice thing about the funding going through the town and not being sort of directly considered an offset in our budget is that it's kind of right there in the bucket with everything else. So.
And sorry, I did just have one final question. I am not sure if you would have this data available with you, but do we have any sense of what the enrollment numbers look like in other surrounding districts, and if they are also seeing slight decreases? So not sure if we have a sense of
I
that.
don't know that off the top of my head, but we can look into that.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay. We're done with enrollment. I guess we can go on to the Metro West Youth Risk Survey results.
This is great. We have Director of Wellness, Roger Anderson, and Kim Tynan, our clinical director, are here to walk us through the data. I have a clicker I'm going to give.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome.
How are you, gang?
Good.
Good to see you all again.
Good to see you.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to see if this works. Look at that. All right, well, Allison introduced us, but again, Roger Anderson, Director of Wellness, nice to see you all.
And Kim Tynan, the clinical director. Nice to see you all.
So we're going to move through this pretty quickly and just share, we've got some really nice things to share with you and some really clear targeted areas that we're looking at. But as we started, we wanted to remind you of what the Metro West Adolescent Health Survey area is. We are later in the presentation are going to show you our data versus the region, and we just wanted to give you a clear picture of the region. You see everything from some communities that are really similar to us to some that are a little bit different. But when we look at the Metro West region, this is the area we're looking at. Additionally, when we talk about the survey, here's a couple key characteristics for you. This is census data for us. In grades 7 through 12, which means we basically have almost all of our students. The Youth Risk Survey from the CDC takes one classroom from any school and then extrapolates out and says, here's your data. And that, based on who's in that particular classroom, can really skew data. The Metro West Healthcare Foundation provides free to us through a grant the ability to survey all of our students every other year. And we used to be on the even years, but COVID bumped us off one, so now we're on the odd years. We are comparable to our peers. There's almost 40,000 data points from our peers. We have almost 1,500 that we collect, 1,500 students worth of data. And generally, it's important to note that the data is generally reliable and valid for a couple reasons. One, it's collected anonymously. It's perceived as important. We do things, the way we talk about it with our students, the fact that we present it here, the fact that we make decisions with this data in mind helps our students understand that it is important. It's voluntary. We have very, very few students opt out, but they have that option with their families. And if it wasn't reliable, we would see data jumping all over the place. And we have general trending stability. Some things trend up, some things are trending down, and some are very stable. Additionally, we are provided 2 languages that the survey is translated into. Right now, that's Portuguese and Spanish along with English. We have asked for more. I think they're considering that because a number of communities has as our area becomes more diverse. And then the last piece that isn't up here, but I always like to remind people, is as much as we would love to take credit for all of the good trends, we cannot draw causality from this data. We can correlate from it and we can look at the way things are happening, but we really can't take all the credit for the good things, nor be blamed for all of the ones that may be challenging. So these are the areas we're going to give you a couple highlights in: substance use, school connectedness, mental health, barriers to seeking support and sleep. And sort of throughout all of this, we're also going to see the impacts of social media and screens in what we do. So we're really pleased with the way our substance use numbers are moving. Over to the right, 2023, the farthest point on the right in your graph, is basically the lowest for all of our indicators almost that they've ever been. And there is one in there that looks a little different than the rest. That's our vaping numbers, and we know that's a graph, and I'll talk about that in a second, that looks an awful lot like one we saw over the past 50 years, but we're really happy. And we also want to recognize that even though these numbers are down, they're not zero. And we would like to continue to drive them down. I think substance use is an area that we're never going to not have our eye on. We're always going to be on top of that because it is a barrier to learning. The graph that looked a little different here is our electronic vaping products. And we have some things on this graph that we really, really like. That sort of mountain from 2016 to 2021 really mirrors what the cigarette use graph looked like over a 50-year period. And the good news is we caught up with it. You know, early in 16 and 18, our youth were being targeted. Unfortunately, the legislature caught up with it, the laws caught up with it, our kids' understanding caught up with it, because that very top line, which is the perceived risk of harm, rose dramatically during that time. We took a lot of efforts to take that on. There was a lot of national media efforts to take that on. But now it's really good that almost 90% of our kids have a clear perceived risk of harm of the vaping devices. And so we feel good about that. We know that, again, even if it's 3% that, you know, currently use it a lot, that impacts them and it impacts their ability to learn. So we got to continue to do things through our curriculum and through our policies to help them move forward. Another area that we're pretty proud of is school connectedness. There's a lot of research that says when kids feel safe at school and when they feel that they're a part of school, they can function well and academically they do better. It's in the category of things that we call protective factors. So whenever we look at the graphs that are purple like this, our numbers are the light purple on the left, and their number, we're comparing that to the Metro West average. So kids in Westborough, almost on every measure, are at a higher percentage than our regional friends. We want the numbers to be at 100%. They're not there yet, but again, we saw dips in these across the entire region when COVID happened. And a tremendous amount of effort went into the SEL practices that we have and creating safe spaces and building relationships, and that continues on. So we're proud of these numbers and we know that work is not done.
Okay. We're now looking at the mental health and suicidality data. And when Roger and I were here in the spring, we spoke about the highlight data that we were starting to see and you know, mentioned to you that we were expecting those numbers to come down. And as you can see, they have decreased. Our students are reporting lower overall levels of distress associated with their mental health, and our students' levels are consistent with high school students across the region. We're going to look at some longitudinal data with regard to mental health and suicidality. We'll start with looking at the high school students. As you can see, we have been collecting these data going back to 2006, and students are reporting the lowest level of reporting life is very stressful since 2006. Generalized anxiety symptoms are lower than we first started collecting this information back in 2018. And depressive symptoms have decreased and are stable at our overtime average. I thought we would take a minute in the next slide to look at what's happening with our Gibbons data, because most of the slides that we're presenting this evening are focused on our high school students. We have similar longitudinal data from our middle school as well. And so in looking at their mental health and suicidality information, similarly, students are reporting the lowest levels of reporting life is stressful in over a decade. Generalized anxiety symptoms are lower than when we first started collecting this data back in 2018. And depressive symptoms have decreased by 6% since the last time we measured it, but we are still a few percentage points higher than where we were at during the 2012-2018 range. This is another, we talk about highlights, we're talking about, you know, areas we really want to celebrate. This is another area that, you know, we want to take a moment to celebrate. So I'm going to have you focus on the column on the far right. This is information that we have been collecting for the past 3 years. And what you see here is that our students are reporting significant improvements with shifting mindsets, lifting barriers, and overall decreased stigma in seeking and receiving support at our schools. This includes students reporting that they perceive counseling could help. They describe increased trust, recognize that counselors may understand their challenges, are less concerned about other students being aware that they may be meeting with a counselor. Students indicate feeling that teachers would not treat them differently and that seeking help will not somehow restrict their opportunities at school.
So one of the areas we want to talk about is how students are using their time. And there's a significant amount of research out there about sleep. And we just felt like, our kids are doing a pretty good job, certainly compared to our Metro West region averages. Our kids are doing their homework, they're getting to it. They're doing extracurricular activities, they're getting sleep, and they're really participating in community activities. And we think this is a real positive to see from our kids at a significant level higher than our peers. So we also want to recognize there's some areas that we really feel, based on the data, we want to lean into and get a good look at and focus on through our curricular efforts and through some of the decisions we make and how we do things. So one of the areas that is definitely a concern for us is time spent online. If you look at the third column there, while we are below our Metro West average peers, which is a good thing, almost half of our kids spend 3 or more hours using their smartphone daily, which is not for school or homework. That's a significant amount of time. So a typical part-time job is 20 hours a week. This is what we're talking about. It's a significant amount of time. And then that number all the way over to the right, where students check their smartphone multiple times per hour during school, we know if they're doing that, they're not engaging in their education at that point necessarily. We have this year convened a working group to look at students, social media, smartphones, the whole gambit of what that is. Tim is on the committee. And we're really looking at what are people doing in the area. We'd like that committee to make some recommendations for the end of the year. But what I can tell you already is happening is that the policies that are in place are being enforced more effectively this year. We get feedback from kids, we get feedback from teachers and administrators that what we're doing with our current policies is working better because we've sort of ramped up our practices about it, and that is going better. And we're looking at what's going on nationally, what's going on around us, and what do we think we can be doing better to help the kids. This graph sort of shows you who's using their phone during school and who's using their phone. The graph on the far left, I ran that back a couple different surveys, and it's not really clear why the seniors are using a little bit less social media right now. That's not a trend that persists. It was sort of random. But the idea that kids, as they get a little bit older, are engaging with their devices a little bit more in that column all the way on the right, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade, that is of concern to us, and that's an area we want to help educate them better. We would hope our seniors would be making better decisions. Part of that may be that they are a little more independent as they move through what we do and making their own decisions. So here's where we really look at what are the kids telling us that they know about their own digital media use, that they're aware of. And you notice in this graph that our students are higher than the Metro West average in every single category. And we'll look at them in groups. The first three, identifying that the use of digital media makes their concentration in school either a little or a lot worse. It makes their performance in school a little or a lot worse, or it makes their sleep a little or a lot worse. That's, almost half, and then well more than half of our students. To me, this sort of feels like almost a cry for help from our students saying, hey, we know we're using it, but we're not sure how to stop. And sometimes when we look at devices and digital media, there's a couple lenses you can look at it. One is that it's a tool, and that we can educate them how to use it well. The other is that it behaves a lot like a substance, and we have things in place where we really limit access to substances for our students. It's not a substance, but the way it impacts the brain is very similar to a substance in that it grabs onto the reward center in the brain, and they get a dopamine hit from whatever's calling to them in there. And so these are areas where we think, hey, we've got to do a better job supporting our students in the decisions they make. We've got to do a better job developing their skills, and we've got to look at what is the access to this happening. We know that the Surgeon General, for example, has said that social media before age 16 is not healthy, not productive. We look at, there's an age when you get access to drive a car because your ability to make decisions is limited potentially prior to that, and then other substances like alcohol. So we're taking a good look at this, and the working group's looking at it, and we've got curriculum in place for a lot of this. And we're looking at expanding that. Kim and I are in a partnership between what goes on in SEL and what goes on in wellness classes, and we're actually developing lessons specifically targeting digital media use.
So another area that we're looking closely at is cyberbullying. And cyberbullying is defined in the Metro West survey as using the internet, cell phones, or other electronic devices to bully, tease, threaten, or spread rumors about someone. This includes through texting, email, social media, platforms such as Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, TikTok, et cetera. As we look closer at the increasing amount of time our teens are spending on social media outside of the school day, it's not surprising that our students are reporting cyberbullying experiences. We're looking closer at our curriculum, as Roger just mentioned, exploring teaching and learning opportunities, not only through PE, health and wellness, and social emotional learning, but also working with technology and the library departments as well. Back in the spring, at the middle school, we conducted another survey that was part of an 8th grade course, an informational course around social media. And we asked some additional questions. And one of the questions we asked is whether or not students had been exposed to hate-based or inappropriate content while they're on social media. And we had 55.7% of our 8th grade students saying yes, they had. So in addition to cyberbullying, that's another piece of information that we need to be looking at that our students have access to.
Yeah, and on top of that, when we talk to our administrators, the disciplinary issues that come up and the barriers that get in the way of learning, a huge percentage of those are tied to communication that goes on via the device. In most cases, it's the smartphone. And so a lot of what comes to school is carried from communication in the device. And so a lot of the time spent by administrators in unraveling things and investigating things is tied to social media and the devices and the way that they are communicating. Here's a really interesting graph. We didn't expect this graph when we dove into the data, but we took a good look at it, and it sort of boils down to student decision making. And we see that our students, these are not good decisions that are being made, and particularly the one all the way to the right, where well over a third of our students who can drive are texting, messaging, or emailing while doing so. And that is a real concern. It's a safety concern, it's a decision-making concern. And it's an example of something where, our students are, maybe having some entitlement about feeling like we know that teenagers are, often think they're bulletproof and make decisions in different ways than our brains do. But we're looking at, again, how do we address this? We want to bring forth some education for our students through curriculum, developing some opportunities for them to practice good habits around their driving. And we're actually working on building a lesson for that, for our students in 10th, 11th, and 12th grade who are most likely to make the decision. So we're sort of collecting data and looking at what we can do with that as well. But it was really interesting to look at, and we felt it was something, we're a little concerned about for sure, and certainly don't all own at the schools, right? This has got to be a community effort to support kids making great decisions. So to finish things up for you, we have ongoing efforts We are looking at what data is presented to us. We've got a great group of people in our schools, from teachers to administrators, school counselors, school psychologists, supporting our students. And the purpose of all of our work is to get the students to be engaged with their learning in the classroom. Remove as many barriers as we can and give them the skills they need to meet the barriers that they're going to come across. That's the real goal of our work. And so we collect data to drive that. Education happens within SEL and health, and as you heard, the library and technology are on board with that. We know that social media is a challenge, and even though it's not on here, we continue to do the work that we have done that we're seeing good results with. The substance use, we're not ever going to take our eye off of that, because we know if that gets out of hand, and we don't know what the next vaping is going to be. And there's always something coming down the road. And so we've got to stay on top of that, making sure our kids have good skills so that whatever it is, they can manage it. Because by the time they're done, we hope they have the skills to be able to navigate their life well. And then we continue to work on the school connectedness, which provides that protective factor for our kids so that they can come in and have safe conversations, they can be engaged in their learning, and they can have success academically, which is sort of the end goal. And that's where we are. I think there was one more slide, but it was a repeat, so I think we've got it.
Questions?
Yeah, thank you very much. This was very interesting. I spent some time earlier today. There's so much data here. I'm sure it wasn't easy to put it together in a meaningful way and then figure out some trends. I'm also very surprised the students were so honest in the responses, actually, especially with the drinking and driving. I mean, I applaud the students for being honest in the response, because that gives you this information. So, couple observations. First of all, looks like the post-COVID recovery is going well. It looks like, looking at the anxiety levels, they definitely peaked, and looked like it peaked more in Gibbons than in the high school. Is this? I'm just curious. Is this something you see across the state, or?
So similar trends across the region where things are getting a little bit better, for sure. And I think it's really interesting if you think about what the impact of COVID is different depending on what age you were when COVID occurred. Right? So the impact on college kids was different than the impact on high school kids, was very different than the impact on elementary kids. And some of it's academic, some of it's social, some of it is their own relationship with themselves. What are some of those key markers that were inhibited for them during that time? And I think we've done a really nice job as a district of leaning into not just the strict curriculum, but what are the skills that the kids need to be able to succeed? And we continue to look at what it is. But yeah, it is a similar trend to across the nation and the region.
I mean, it's good to see it's going down. I don't know if you have that data. It would be interesting to kind of track grade by grade. So like, the same students in first grade as they age, and then see how those numbers change. I'm sure a lot of it correlates with their age, with their maturity, but also, that would be interesting to see how the school is doing over time for the same grade.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We do have that data. I mean, we have lots of data, and we do look at that, right? And we do also see that some classes are more impacted than others, just as the nature of the makeup of the group. But we do watch that very carefully and look at, our students and how they're doing from the year prior. And so when we come and talk in the spring again, we'll have more cumulative data now from our universal screening, looking specifically at the classes. And we're seeing some really nice overall decreasing trends within classes. So we just screened our middle school students a couple weeks ago and saw some nice decreases in their overall symptoms of depression and anxiety. So, things are going in the right direction. And again, we can't,
It's good to hear.
we can't take full ownership, right, of those things. However, I do think that the work we're doing is impactful. And we continue to be concerned about the students who are impacted, right? So the students who are experiencing a high level of distress, we want to make sure we meet their needs as well. And we recognize that providing them with these skills and these opportunities for more advanced skill learning with our counselors prepare them to manage these potential crises and be less impacted overall.
Thank you. One last comment. If you switch to slide with the screen use, that's slide 12.
Is it that one? I don't have the numbers in front of me.
Oh, no, it's the student time utilization. No, that's sleep. Time spent online.
Sleep slide.
Oh, this one.
This one?
No. The one.
Right
There
there.
you go. Sorry.
Yeah.
So this one. Well, first of all, I think as a generation, we don't have an easy job right now because I think we're still behind research on the impact of this, how it's really going to impact our generation, and like a lot of this work I think is based on at least years ago was based on some gut feeling, especially parents like myself. We didn't have any guidelines. 10 years ago, 8 years ago about it. I mean, there were some guidelines, but they weren't consistent. So I'd be curious, do you have a target where you would like those numbers to be? Where, what do you think would be a healthy range?
No.
Just lower than that.
I do not. I mean, we do not. I think because I think there's so many factors that impact it that are not within our control. We certainly know that when they are using the device, they are not engaged with their education in that moment typically. And the amount of time they're doing, and again, not to jump around, but in, where is it? Where am I going here, Kim? Here we go.
Right there.
The kids tell us that this is a concern to them, and they know it, but they don't necessarily know how to manage it. And even if they do, we're not sure their brains are wired to do that well at this point. When we look at brain scans and where in the brain they make these decisions, it's not the same place that you and I do. Right. We're sort of frontal cortex driven now because it's pretty well developed at my age anyway. And that area of the brain doesn't necessarily light up for them. So we have to really look at, what is it that we're asking them to do, and what policies and procedures do we have in place to protect them, as well as provide them with the skills to be able to navigate it themselves. And so a specific number, no, but are we working on driving it down 100% for sure?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. These data are really fascinating. I especially appreciate our ability to compare Westborough to the aggregate number for Metro West. And I agree with your point that the students really are aware of just how detrimental the usage of the devices are, and social media more broadly. And they are, I think you use the expression, that this is they're crying out for help. Mm-hmm. And they really are, and you're absolutely correct in saying that they don't know how to manage it, and developmentally they're not at a place where they know how to go about doing that. So right, it's especially incumbent on us as the adults to help guide that. I do have a specific question. This is, it's a minor question, but I'm curious about it. The school connectedness graph, which is either the last slide or the earlier in the presentation, the data point, I feel close to people at school. And I see that it's 68% for Westborough, which, doesn't sound bad, but flipped around, that means 32% don't. And I guess that's what stood out to me, is that number's high. And especially given the way that the question is asked, it's about their feelings. How do they feel? And even students, so I think of myself in high school, I knew that I wasn't part of a particular clique that everyone wanted to be a part of, at least socially. But I still had a small group of friends with whom I felt very connected. And so so one is just a comment that the number is lower than I would have expected, the 68%. My question is, do you have the data for previous years to see if there is a trend there? Because what I'm wondering is there a correlation as well with smart device usage and social media, and that's the result of that usage and why we're seeing it trending down, if it's trending down?
We also feel the same as you. And we think about the 32% a great deal, as do our administrators as well, right? And so as far as more specifics around students, what the profile of the student looks like, of the students who are not feeling as connected, there are going to be more resources available through the Metro West where we can look more closely at that. And so we look forward to having that additional information very soon.
Yeah, they're supposed to be, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Kim. They're supposed to provide us a data dashboard where we can ask that exact question for any of the data that we have. And we're supposed to get that within the next week or two. So we'll come back to you with that information. We'll just send it along. But definitely it went down during COVID. But we can certainly look at the social media piece and look. I didn't look back far enough to be able to give you that answer, but we will.
And we do have it.
Yep, we'll get it.
All set?
Yeah.
Okay, Sarah.
Thank you so much for putting this together. This was really, it's really good work, very interesting to look at all of this data. One thing I had two questions. One of them was you did speak to the enforcement efforts at the schools. I know that I've seen communications go out, but aside from that, can you speak a little bit to what the enforcement efforts have been and what the mechanism is by which, we're trying to control the usage of phones or whatnot in the classrooms?
Sure. I think just a really simple picture. At the K-3 level, there are no phones present. At the 4 to 6 level, they are not to be seen during school at all, ever. And that includes watches. And, it's worth noting that our principal at Mill Pond, Peter Gilnitz, helped lead a group to put together a really nice video on digital devices and digital media use. It's targeted to parents. It was shown at all 3 of the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade open houses, and then we pushed it out to the entire K-12 parental group through Parent Square. So that's a really nice 10-minute video that sort of talks parents through, this is the whole enchilada. And when you give it to a kid, you're giving them unrestricted access to a whole lot of stuff. And there are actually some other devices, and there is a lot of research that you can weight and other ways to do that. But following what I was talking about at the middle school, they're not to have their phones during any educational time. And that's very, very tightly watched and tightly monitored. And at the high school, they are again, there is a new enforcement of the norm now. When they go into classrooms, there's one of those shoe trees, and everybody puts their phone in there, and they are not to be having them during class time at all. But they are allowed to use them during passing time, break, and lunch, and before and after school, obviously. So that's sort of the policy that has not particularly changed. The more strict enforcement of that is definitely in play, certainly at the high school. And we're seeing positive results. The teachers actually cheered in a faculty meeting about that because they felt like, we needed to really meet what that policy was a little bit better. So we've tightened that up for sure.
Great. And the other question was with respect to the attempted suicide question on, so I know the data that's being collected is I guess they're doing it, they're not doing a handwritten survey, are they? Or is it online?
It's online.
It's online. it's anonymous, but I'm wondering in terms of the reporting requirements, if there's anything, if somebody's at harm to themselves or to somebody else, if there's any further action that's taken with respect to that.
So that's one of the reasons why, when we've been looking at this data across many years, that, Roger and I were really wanting us to adopt a universal screening data system in our schools so that we could identify these kids. Because there is no mechanism to identify the kids per the Metro West survey. So now, the only way to know would be if a student were to come forward at school in some way, or now that we have our universal screenings happening, our mental health screenings at the middle school and high school, all the students are screened, their names are attached, and then those students who are experiencing some significant distress, and there are questions around thoughts of thinking about death, those students are seen immediately by counselors.
But do you find that the lack of the, anonymity is an issue for getting answers that are correct or truthful answers?
We find that our universal screening data aligns very consistently with our Metro West data. So we see the same trends. So we feel that although that data, the universal screening data that we do in the schools, is not anonymous, we feel that kids are being honest with us.
Yeah, it's amazing how well it aligns. We've looked at it by grade, so we're looking at the 10th graders anonymously doing the Metro West survey, and then what does our universal screening tell us about our 10th graders? And we're within a percentage point or two across most of the ones we're doing. And then, as Kim said, we engage with those students. Some may be receiving help outside of the schools. They are already aware of it and they're working on it. Some may be engaging with support within the schools, and some may be that we didn't know about and they weren't sharing yet. And so, again, that universal screener, I think, you guys asked us 4 or 5 years ago here, are we tracking specific grades? And so the universal screener is the way that we do that, and we do follow it. And now we're following kid by kid, making sure that those that need the support get it. So it's a really good question, Sarah.
On the day of the screening, those kids are seen, in some cases, we rank them out based on level of need, and they're seen immediately.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Awesome. Good evening to you both. Thank you for the presentation and for coming down tonight. I had 2 questions. The first was relating to the barriers to seeking support slide at schools. I understand that you said up front that all this data is great, but that we can draw from it correlation but not causation. I would just be curious if you could speak quickly on some of the things that you think may have changed. A lot of these numbers were very encouraging, and just if it was a big push around education or additional resources or a combination of the two.
I think a lot has been put in place that I'm hoping has led to the shift. And I think that it isn't just the work that's happening with the high school counselors. I think it's the work that happens with all of the counselors and mental health professionals all the way into kindergarten, right? So, I think that our counselors do a really great job of being present in the schools, moving around the schools, participating in school events, being seen as a resource. In the past few years, we've been putting out a packet to students about who are the people that can help you in the school. Last year, one of our counselors generated a QR code with that information that was posted throughout the building. And that actually was the first social emotional learning lesson of the year at the high school this year is, how do you identify your supports? And so, it's through all those efforts. And I also would like to think that it's also through the experiences of students, right? So students are, I'm anticipating that they're having positive experiences with the counselors and that they're learning some skills and learning to manage some of their challenges more successfully, which is leading them to talk to their friends, right? I mean, they are they're the consumer for sure, and they're the ones that we want to be satisfied with the service.
Yeah, I think we've had some overt efforts to destigmatize, mental health issues for a long time, certainly in the health and wellness world, that we were able to expand last year with 4, 5, and 6 coming on board. And so it's our hope that the kids do feel safe to come forward and get the support they need. And we often use the analogy, if you see somebody walking down the hall with a broken leg, limping their way along, are you just going to ignore them? Or if you have a broken leg, are you not going to go get any help? And we know that a lot of the challenges our kids face, we can help them provide skills, or with an outside counselor, they can be provided skills to be able to navigate that and help themselves re-engage with their learning and be fully present.
I will just say it is great to see those efforts paying off in the data. The only other question I had was around the slide on digital media use. Obviously, Westborough is doing a very good job, and it seems, at least to me, that the schools are doing a really good job educating the students on the effects of these devices and their time online. I would just be curious. I know that you talked about how we're developing new classes and curriculum around this. Do you find, is this mostly drawn from other other districts and people also doing this, or is Westborough creating a lot of this material that they're teaching kids, or?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things, right? So we look at our kids, and we had a little while ago a group of upperclassmen come to us and say, hey, we're really struggling with effectively saying no and getting ourselves out of tricky situations. And so we are responsive to our particular students. We also look at best practices nationwide and what type of lessons are out there and what type of curriculum is out there, and we draw from that as well. And we hope that combination really meets the specific need here with best practices.
Sure. And I guess just to make sure, I would just be curious if you would see Westborough as a leader potentially in this space, especially in the district, or if this is something you see a lot of other schools doing as well.
Well, we certainly know that the universal screening, we were sort of at the front of the pack on that. And again, at your direction or your question for us, we moved on that in a way that allows us to really meet the needs of the kids very specifically. And I think a lot of people are wrestling with all of this digital media. It's certainly a national hot button topic. So I don't think we're alone in it by any stretch. And we want to be very thoughtful about how we approach it. Because it has a lot of impacts on the community. Again, they're with us for a portion of their day. And I think our community as a whole needs to really be looking at what's in the best interest of our kids, and we'll continue to work really hard to do our piece of that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Very good.
Yeah, I actually have one question. Will students have access to this data, either through SEL moments or just an email?
So we'll post this data on our website. We always like to get school committee to have first crack at it and see it. But then we always post it on the wellness website. We do engage with the data through some of our wellness classes. So we have opportunities in 9th grade health, which is a long time ago for you, but you did a great job with that, to engage with the data and look at what the trends are. And we blend that into a number of the different projects. So when you're looking at analyzing influences, we'll bring a couple pieces of the data in, but the overall key indicator report will be posted on the website and accessible to anyone. And then once we're excited to get the dashboard, because that's going to allow us to do some really targeted looking at things and hopefully be able to push out to the community, some data about us and some of the neat things that are going on and areas we want to focus on. So yes. Sorry, that was a really long yes.
Yeah, the other thing I would just ask you, Reagan, so as far as sharing out the presentation without context, I feel like people benefit from the more information in the context of the charts. If you have any ideas for us on how we can share information with students and provide them with, we're happy to provide the data. We would love to provide the context too. And so if you have some ideas or thoughts about how we could, share little bits of the information out to the school, we would love to do that.
I think you were asking me something else too. And because I saw you a week and a half ago at a meeting. The Teen Mental Health Initiative is a club where we are going to be sharing this data with them. And they're going to be working with our teachers on their SEL moments, and they're going to be looking at ways that we can push this data out to students in meaningful ways as well. So thank you for asking that. I was sorry I was a little slow in my
That was
answer.
kind of prompted.
Part of your job to pick these things up.
Oh, man.
Okay, well, obviously, everybody has asked all kinds of questions in terms of your presentation, and I have one that's technical. If you go to the Westborough High School longitudinal data chart,
Yep, we'll get there in 1 second.
okay,
Here
if
we
you
go.
look down the column on the right, which explains everything, you have asterisks and you have stars and you have double stars and other things. Can you explain what they are, or should they not be there?
Absolutely. Those are tied to what the question was. And underneath the graph that is cut off, it gives you a description of the question that was asked as to what is generalized anxiety. And then it gives the question of what is self-injury, what is the question that drives that data set. We will get that to you and we were trying to make the data, because we know it's tight and there's a lot there, we're trying to make it readable. But basically the star and the asterisk and the other things are just letting you know, here's what the exact language of that question was.
Okay, that's
So,
good.
very fair question.
And even if it was a separate, blank sheet afterwards, at least it's there.
Yeah.
Yep, very good
That's a
point.
good point.
Okay, we all set? Think we are. Daniel, you got any questions?
No, I've seen the data, but thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I do want to sort of compliment our crew for coming out here tonight. I do think the work that's going on here is very, very thoughtful, and kind of in combination, this type of data with universal screening is very powerful. It allows us to both kind of look at these trends over time for anonymous reporting and then be responsive to kids in kind of more crisis mode. So I think it's great work and I just happen to have landed in this place doing great work. So I'm deeply appreciative of that. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, the next item on the agenda is citizens' request. Is there anyone in the hall who would like to speak to the community and the school committee? Seeing none, no one has raised their hand in the hall, we'll move on. School committee reports. Yakub.
Nothing to report, really. I just want to make a little advertisement for an event. This Saturday there will be a row for WASA. It's a fundraiser to support the Westborough Athletic and Social Association. The rowing will start at 10 a.m. and there will be a team from our school administration. I'll be there as well with a different team, and there will be face painting, live music, and all kinds of other stuff. Many vendors, so just reaching out to community, please show up and cheer our teams. Thank you.
Steve?
Nothing to report tonight.
Carol?
Nothing to report tonight.
Tim?
Nothing to report tonight.
Reagan?
All right. For Armstrong, there's not much upcoming this week, but they're going to have parent conferences, which will be held on October 25th. For Hastings, on the 23rd, the students will have a practice bus evacuation drill when they arrive at school. And they also have Hastings Fall Fest, which is Saturday, October 19th, from 11 to 3 in the gym and on the field. There will be bouncy houses, a ton of games, raffle baskets, and much more. Donations and volunteers would be greatly appreciated for this event. And they just wanted to have a thank you to the Hastings parent group for making this event possible. For Fails, they are excited for their pumpkins, pizza, and movie night, which will be this Friday, the 18th. Families are invited to gather in the cafeteria where they're going to watch movies, enjoy pizza. Students get to wear their pajamas, bring sleeping bags, blankets, pillows, and a bunch of stuff and get to enjoy the show. They also wanted to give a thanks to the Fails parent group for organizing this event. And then next week, from October 21st to the 25th, they're going to be starting collecting items for the Westborough Food Pantry. Their focus will be on quick meal items, which is like ramen noodles, mac and cheese, soup, pasta, and more. For Mill Pond, the 256 sixth graders had their nature's classroom trip for this week. They also had a one-day fundraiser, and they raised over $4,370 for hurricane relief, which is very impressive. And then they also had a warm and welcoming fourth grade food fest on Wednesday night, and they brought together the families of the fourth grade. For Gibbons, they have their fall dance on the 18th from 7 to 9 p.m. Their play of Charlotte's Web is going to be next week, the 25th to the 27th. And then the posters for the Westborough Lions Peace Poster Conference are due this Friday. And then parent-teacher conferences are upcoming and will be held November 6th with signups opening on the 1st. And then lastly, for the high school, we had a very successful homecoming dance and festival. Tonight, we have a band exchange concert from 7 to 8 as students from Germany have joined Westborough High School for the past few days, which is very exciting. Tomorrow, on the 17th, we have our fall choral concert, and Friday the 18th is our school-wide picture day. Kind of for the community, Student Council is hosting a haunted house on Sunday the 27th from 6 to 8 p.m. at 5 Charles Street. Anyone in the town is welcome to attend. It's free and suitable for all ages, but donations would be greatly appreciated. And then Center Stage will perform Almost Maine on November 8th and 9th, and tickets will be brought at school lunches and at the door of the show. And then lastly, for an athletic update, this was the first year Westborough High School had a pickleball club at their team at our school, and they had a state championship yesterday, and they won in 3 categories of mixed doubles, men doubles, and women's singles. So that's all.
Thank you. That's a lot. I guess my report is simple tonight in that we had talked some time ago about the school committee paying attention, I guess, to various school needs. And so the school committee has met twice with the facility staff in the school and also here in the conference room on this floor, and have gone through the majority of items, big and small, that are out there to deal with. And that will eventually, I guess, turn into items that I think Allison mentioned in the beginning of the meeting in regards to the budget. And also in the interim from our last meeting, Allison, could you report, as you did to us, in terms of the status of the bus contract effort?
Yes. So we have posted now the request for bids, so that's gone out, and that was live, we believe, as of Tuesday of this week, and we're looking forward to getting those in. I think they'll be coming in just in time for the budget season, which is helpful. We'll be able to have numbers that feel more solid going into budget hearing season. In that bus bid, there is sort of standard language, but also an alternative in the event that vendors are looking to do fleet electrification. So we've included that option as a sort of alternative price point for the vendors, modeled a little bit on kind of what we heard with some information here, but also other districts that have done that. Not very many have. Wellesley did, and so we took a look at their language, and Anita sort of put that together in a way that we thought would both allow companies to tell us if they were pursuing that, but also not dissuade anybody from bidding. So we tried to strike a balance there.
Do you recall what the bid date is?
I don't off the top of my head, but I'll find out and let you know.
Okay.
Yep.
And that's it for me. So the next item on the agenda is action items and discussion associated with the zero electric vehicle policy. If you recall, we've actually talked about it twice now. The first time was just information for the school committee to review the documents. Last time we ended up with a glitch, and so we couldn't move forward at that time. At this time, the items for discussion, the red line version and the final revised zero-emission vehicle policy. And I guess at that point, I'll ask for any questions or comments or discussion on any of this. Yakub?
Yeah, just two questions. So how would the policy, if at all, would impact the school department? Because I don't see any mention of the buses as far as exempt vehicles. There's a mention of trucks. No mention of the buses. Could you speak to that?
I can. First of all, this policy is at the behest of DOER, which is the Department of Energy Research. And basically, they have the power of the state behind them requesting, in effect, with, I guess, with a club and a fist, that in fact we create such a policy for the town. At this point, it only deals with the vehicle sizes that are in there, and only in the sense that that the weight limit applies. If you recall, in there, there's a weight limit, I think of, it's 8,000, I can't remember whether it's pounds or kilograms.
It's not in the policy itself, right?
No, it's, if it wasn't attached, there's a table of definitions at the end. Why don't you skim to the end of it?
8,500 pounds.
Yeah, pounds. Okay, so school buses are on the order of 30,000 pounds, so they're excluded. And in part because the state legislature has not created the legal document that would require us to do it. On the other hand, it is the policy of the town to try to move forward in that direction. And as Allison said, there's an option in what's put out there for a bid to acquire some financial information associated with what it would cost for a vendor to supply such an electric bus. And as you know from both discussions with presentation to us by National Grid, as well as the information that we've been working on over the last year or so, that there are pros and cons to the whole thing. But the only thing that really matters, I think, at this point, is to know, what the impact is going to be cost-wise as well as performance. And at this point, we have information, but we don't know how true it is. I think that answers your question. That's why school buses are not in there.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Steve? Sarah?
Well, I guess just, related sort of to what Jakub was saying, I'm trying to understand, we are just accepting this. I mean, it's being provided to us and I guess what I'm trying to understand is why we have to vote on it.
Well, first of all, we already did vote on this, okay? The
That's
red
right.
line version is the markup from what we approved as a school committee. First in line, if you will, I'm going to say in May of 2024. In part because it is a town policy that those vehicles that could be electrified under the criteria would be, which implies that if we have to go out and buy, let's say, a standard van or a standard car, the document here would require us to follow those criteria that's in here. There's certain exemptions, but generally it would apply to, car-sized vehicles. You can also see in here that the DPW is also subject to this for certain sized vehicles, but they are exempt relative to, let's say, construction vehicles per se. So I think common sense would say that the issue would be with the markups, because we've already voted on the original version of this and improved it. I do have an issue with this, and it's a presumption that what's before us is quote-unquote the final policy. And it isn't the final policy until the school committee decides it is its final policy. And the issue I have is if you go down to section 3, is the applicability. The last part of that sentence wasn't there in what we approved. And what I'm speaking to is including in the future vehicles that are currently exempt within all departments of the town of Westborough. And I'm not going to accept that. In my opinion, it's illogical to be asked to include anything that we don't know anything about. And until we do know about it, I would suggest that I would strike that sentence and go back to what was in the original draft. So in fact, that's my reservation in regards to the vote. Otherwise, I think all the other red lines in here generally do apply to somebody else and not the school committee, and therefore, in and of those changes, I wouldn't see any reason why we would approve it. Tim?
Nothing further to add at this time.
So I don't know what we do with this, because in effect, it's alleged to be the final draft. And like I said, there's two things we could do. We could, in effect, strike that and sign a document without it, or we could ask them to remove it and then give it back to us again. So it's up to the committee as to, first of all, whether you agree with me that we shouldn't include something that we don't know anything about. And then secondly, the process and the method by which we get a final document we can sign. Any suggestions?
I just note from an efficiency standpoint, if you vote a version with that part stricken that you have a concern about, then you may not have to talk about it again.
Well, I agree, but on the other hand, they're not going to accept
They may not.
a markup, and we'll be in the same boat we were the first time.
True.
So I think I would recommend that we don't sign it, and we ask them to remove that section. And if they do, then we'll bring it back, and I guess at this point, as a committee, we could vote it without that section. And if they make the change and give it back to us, then the committee can sign,
Great.
without having to deal with it again.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think that's a reasonable request, and I think that I understand your reservation with respect to that, and I think that I agree.
So if that's a motion,
I move to, are we going to move to approve this with having stricken the portion of the applicability clause that states, including in the future vehicles that are currently exempt within all departments of the town of Westborough?
is there a second?
Second.
Okay. I'm just going to pull out the red line version and see what it used to look like so that we actually know what we want it to be.
You used to say this policy applies to all non-exempt vehicles within all departments of the town of Westborough.
Okay, so that's actually what this motion is made to do by striking that section, which is not. That. And Steve seconded that, so if everybody understands what we're doing, all those in favor? Aye. 5-0-0. So in effect, that takes care of those two items. Next one is the budget summary meeting minutes for approval. I would make that motion that we approve the minutes of 9/26/24, the budget summit meeting.
I'll second that.
Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? What do we got here? We got 4-0-1.
I abstain.
I just voted you that.
Oh, okay, sorry. I misheard. 401.
Yeah. And the last one is the minutes of our last meeting, October the 2nd.
I move to approve the minutes of October 2nd, 2024.
I'll second that.
Okay, any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Aye. Very good, I think that's it. Anybody else before we adjourn? Okay, is there a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
I second.
There you go. All those in favor?
Aye.
That we can vote 5-0-0. Thank you all. It's been a very interesting meeting, Allison.
Yeah.
A lot of good stuff.
Next time.